Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Jasper Dent. I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers, Saskatoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the joint launch of The Dark King Swallows the World by Robert Penner, and I think we've been here before by Suzy Krause. You both have very long titles, so I do have to look at them to remember them. I'd like to start off the evening by acknowledging that we're gathered on Treaty 6 territory. This is the land of the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, and homeland of the Métis. Thank you so much to Suzy and Robert for joining us tonight, and also to Radiant Press for publishing their books and for working with us to create this event. We've got some folks joining us online, so there is a web camera up to your right here. It will not be focused on the audience. However, it will pick up your phone if it rings during the event, so now would be a great time to turn that off or silence it. If you would like to buy copies of Robert or Suzy's books, we've got them obviously up here on the signing table and also on the desk by where you first came in. Now, I would like to introduce our authors. Robert Penner lives and works in Winnipeg, Manitoba. He is the author of Strange Labor, one of Publisher Weekly's best science fiction books of 2020. He's published numerous short stories in a wide range of speculative and literary journals under both his name and various pseudonyms. He was also the founding editor of the online science fiction zine Big Echo. Suzy Krause is the best-selling author of Sorry I Missed You and Valencia and Valentine. She grew up on a little farm in rural Saskatchewan and now lives in Regina, where she writes novels inspired by crappy jobs, creepy houses, personal metaphorical apocalypses, and favorite songs. All the best topics. Her work has been translated into Russian and Estonian. I believe we have Robert coming up first, so everyone please give him a very warm welcome.
Thanks, Jasper. Hi, folks. Thanks for coming out. This is the book, Dark King Swallows the World. Yes, it's a very long title. I'm going to try to keep things relatively brief, so I'm just going to say a few words, read a section I think is appropriate, a few more words, another section, a few more words, and another section. But like I said, I'll try to keep it short. The book itself is a very straightforward sort of coming-of-age fantasy, inspired by childhood reading, especially. So my father read me all those sort of English coming-of-age classics like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. The Dark also Rising. So from a very young age, I had this idea of England in my head and its relationship to sort of fantasy and speculative fiction and all of that. It was really important to me. And then when I had a daughter, I read the same books to her. And as an adult, your relationship with those books changes quite a bit. So this book is in some ways a response to how I changed in those years. So it's about childhood. I wouldn't say it's necessarily for children, but it's a book about children and particularly parent-children relationships. So the first passage I'm going to read, it's set in England. A 12-year-old girl has been separated from her mother during World War II for quite some time. They're both Americans, and she's traveling by train to meet her mother again in southwestern Cornwall, which is where the story's set. So it's a very, I would say, sort of typical kind of shift where a small, unimportant event happens, and it's supposed to indicate in some way that she's beginning to shift from sort of the world that she's used to, the world of reality, into this new fantastical world where she's going to end up. So this is the first passage I'll read. Her name's Nora. More about that later. She woke as the train descended windswept hills into a forest of tall evergreens. The view seemed very rugged and un-English to her, maybe German or Swiss, but even more surprising than the alpine landscape was the small man sitting across from her playing solitaire on the fold-out table beneath the window. He had on an old-fashioned, well-worn but very neat dark suit. His head was suspended in a halo of gray hair, heavy caterpillar eyebrows bunched together in concentration. A mustache drooped over a straggly goatee. His hands hovered above the cards. The fine hairs on the back of them grew thicker and blacker as they crept up his wrists and vanished into the mellow white of his shirt. Nora watched through half-lidded eyes as the little hands started to dart about, and the cards snapped and cracked in a blur of intricate movement. She watched in a reverie for quite some time. The sun flashed in and out of the tall trees along the track. The creak and moan of the carriage sounded like an old sailing ship, like they were cutting across the waves on a breezy day. Occasionally, the old man looked up at her slyly from beneath his beetled brow as his fingers danced about. When their eyes finally met, Nora smiled at him, and he gave her a small smile in return. Good sleep, yes, he asked, and she could hear the burr of an accent. Maybe something Teutonic, something that matched the scenery. It was lovely, said Nora, and stretched. She dug around in her bag and found a can of peppernuts her grandmother had packed for her. She popped one in her mouth. Would you like one? She proffered the can to the old man. Thank you, he said, plucked one out and began sucking on it noisily as he returned to his cards. What funny cards, Nora said. I thought you were playing patience, but the cards don't seem quite right. It's a piquet deck, said the old man. It has fewer cards than a bridge deck. He looked up at her, and this time his smile was so big that for a second his bright eyes vanished entirely. It's better for telling the future, he said. Fewer mistakes. Can you read the future? Nora asked. No, said the old man, but sometimes I can read the cards, and the cards can read the future. Nora giggled. Can you read my cards? Well, he said, I have been winning, and that always makes one a little more hopeful about such chancy endeavors as divination. He shuffled the cards into a tidy stack, and had Nora cut them and shuffle them herself. Then he shuffled them again and laid out 4, face up and across, the Jack of Hearts, the Jack of Spades, the Queen of Diamonds, and a Knight of Hearts. He made Nora cut the deck again and lay the top card out in the middle of the cross. It was the King of Spades. He frowned. I think that card is for me, he said. It usually is. Let us try again. So that's the first passage I'm going to read. And like I said, it's just one of those introductory passages that are supposed to indicate sort of a shift into another world. This isn't the passage I was planning on reading when I got to Saskatoon this morning, but something changed my mind. I spent quite a bit of time at the fancy art gallery by the river. I can't remember what it's called.
Right.
And I really like small galleries because you have a compression of different kinds of arts. It's not just, you're not just stuck staring at one kind for a long time. And there were some 19th century sort of traditional representations of the Saskatchewan countryside right beside some abstract pictures, which had just plains and colors. And it just made me think about the way in which particularly speculative fiction and fantasy sort of does the same game where they take something you're kind of used to, and then they shift it around and move it just a little. And I think it helps looking at the art to think about that. And then after you see these arts, these abstract pieces beside the realism, you go back to the lit and you go, oh, it's the same sort of thing happening here. And so I flipped and I decided there's a sequence of passages in the first third of the book still, but it's where Nora, the main character, is moving from one world to the next, and things are getting very strange. And it's exactly that process of the familiar becoming very unfamiliar. So I just thought I'd read you just this string of passages. It's just her brother's died in an accident, and she's met a girl in the countryside who is either a fox or a fairy or a girl. There's just something weird going on. And then things get very strange. And this sequence of sort of experiences happen. Nora walked through the fields at night. She didn't know where she was going. The sky was glutted with stars, more stars than there should be, extra stars, so many she could not pick out the constellations. The ones she knew were drowned in the ones she did not. No Cassiopeia, no Pleiades, no Ursa Major. The light was a brilliant rain falling through the darkness. She could hear the trees growing, the grass growing, the earth groaning, the beams and the railroads and the mines far beneath her feet, creaking and sighing. She heard a sound above her like a sheet being torn and looked towards it. A barn owl sliced through the air and swung about her at a distance of 30 or so feet, in a slow, controlled arc. Nora could see in crystal clear detail the serrated overlap of its feathers, the white heart of its face, the stains around its black eyes, beak like a claw, taloned feet drawn up into relaxed fists beneath it. It called out to Nora twice, a cry that grew from a mellow growl to a shrill intensity and tapered off. Nora stared at her mother as she slept. I should have paused. account. Nora stared at her mother as she slept. The skin on her arms and throat looked pale and thin as onion paper. There was movement beneath the translucence, shifting shadows that would concentrate into black veins and disperse, cracks and fractures. Words formed, names. Some Nora recognized, others she did not. Vague faces, palm prints, small hands pressed against her mother's thin skin from inside her body. All my unborn siblings, thought Nora. When Mr. Lowry prayed before meals, a halo would appear behind his head. The colors of his clothes would become saturated with light. Nora would hear church songs. He was a stained glass saint in a cathedral. Her and Charles and her mother were dull peasants in the pews. She knew something was going wrong, either the world or her perception of it, but she didn't mind it. It was almost pleasant, like sliding in and out of a dreamy sleep on a lazy Sunday morning and knowing it didn't matter what was real and what wasn't. Tressa was holding Nora's hands, and they were staring into each other's eyes. But Nora could not recognize the colors she saw in those of the other girl. Not quite green, almost, but not quite. What color is that, she thought. Is that hemlock, mandrake, toe of frog? Is it adder's fork or photosynthesis? Is it transmutation? I will set Sam free, Tressa said, but you must do the same for me. Sam is free, said Nora. He is dead. Mr. Winter set him free. Nora saw a fox sitting in the middle of the road, in the middle of the night, illuminated by the headlights. Rust, ochre, cream, and black, each hair perfectly delineated from the next. Bottomless pupils ringed by the thinnest bands of gold. You set him free already, said Nora. He's gone. He's dead. Half gone, said Tressa. Half dead. What do you mean? A living child for the dead, dead for the living. I don't understand. I will set Sam free, but you must do the same for me. A fox in the road is a fox in a cage, thought Nora. A fox in the field is a fox that is free. Yes, said Tressa. Exactly. A fox in a field is a fox that is free. Aren't we for time? Do I have time for one more? All right. So that's the shift to fantasy. One of the things that's really important about this book to me is that I'm trained in history. I did a PhD in history, and then when I was traveling in Cornwall, the experience of seeing the landscape had a real impact on me because it's completely different than what you imagine before you go there, particularly when you've read a lot about it. And traditionally in Cornwall, in England, Cornwall is represented as sort of this fragment of the medieval past, and that's sort of off in the countryside and very distant from London. But from what I've been studying and what I experienced in Cornwall, I actually felt it as something else entirely, as something more Atlantic that was attached to Africa and Jamaica and settlement in North America and this movement of people around the world. So that's kind of the fantasy I wrote rather than the traditional sort of Arthurian swords and sorcery fantasy. And one of the characters I inserted in this narrative was a revivalist priest, a Methodist priest, who may or may not come from the 18th century. In this scene, Nora and the priest are on the run from something. And Nora's trying to figure out where he's coming from or where he's from, and they have this conversation while they're picnicking. Where are you from? Asked Nora. America, said Gauss. I suppose. You suppose? Nora laughed. Don't you know? Hard to say, hard to know. It's been a long time since I've been asked. Well, what do you remember? What's your first memory? My first memory? It's the preacher's strong hands dunking me under the water when I was baptized and born again. Before that, Nora said, your childhood. Where were you before you were born again? I can't really say before that. It's always been an ocean spray and him singing as far back as I remember. He took a bite of his sandwich and carried on talking with his mouth full. Hard riding on hard roads, Bibles in the lantern light, strange folks with open homes. My goodness, said Nora. You're difficult to talk to. What did your parents do? Where did they live? They were preachers too, he smiled. They lived in the world like I do, in the same manner, and their parents before them, back and forth across the prairies, through the woods and over the hills, back and forth across the oceans, keeping the good news moving, keeping it circulating from port to port, from town to town. That's where I'm from. Not from a place, but from a movement, from an endless circulation, an endless repetition, around and around the Atlantic cauldron. I remember chapels in the hazy hot hills of Jamaica, on the baking plains of Texas, lumber camps in Minnesota, mining shanties in the Yukon, revivals in the big cities, saving souls of sailors on the docks, the soldiers in the camps, the miners at the pit heads. My earliest memory is the glowing faces of the throngs, hungry for the gospel, hungry for the good word. My earliest memory is the word in German, English, Spanish, French, the word. Have you heard the good word, Nora? Are you hungry for some peace? Are you ready to be saved? Oh, please, Mr. Gauss. Nora felt amused and exasperated in equal measure. I just want to know where you're from. Well, he shrugged, I suppose the same place as you, child. Yes, said Nora, America? But where in America? America, Gauss shrugged. I suppose, yes, well, anyways, America, at the same place, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. I think I'll end that there, and thanks for your attention, and I'll hand it over to Suzy.
Oh. We'll do it, Rick. Thank you. Yeah, that works. I started reading Robert's book this week, and I'm really, really into it. It's very good. You should all get it because I haven't read fantasy in such a long time, and it's so fun to read. I am only going to read one chapter, but my chapters in my book are very short. I will not read this chapter, but the shortest chapter in my book is like a paragraph long. I'll read one a little bit longer than that, but I feel like people often start reading kind of from closer to the book so they don't have to give a lot of context or so that they don't do any spoilers, but I'm going to read from chapter 43, so I'll have to give you a little bit of context first. But yeah, this book is about a family in a rural Saskatchewan village who finds out that their father, Marlin, has terminal illness and he's probably going to die very soon. But while he and all of them, did I wreck something?
Let's give you this microphone instead.
It might just be me.
I'll try that again.
Hello? Yeah, good.
There we go.
Okay, so while Marlin and his family are coming to grips with this, the news breaks that the world is about to end and they are all going to die. That might feel like a spoiler, but it's on the back of the book. So, but yeah, this story follows this family as they process their now extremely apparent mortality and as they work to resolve relational issues and figure out how to spend the rest of their life, which they find will be about 3 months long. So Hilda, Marlin's wife, is one of the main characters, and she's an artist, not by trade, but it's something that she loves to do. And at the beginning of the book, she's noticing that her kitchen needs painting because it's peeling and looking kind of dated. But when she finds out the world is ending, she kind of says to herself, well, I guess I don't have to paint the kitchen now. But as the book goes on and she gets closer to the end of her life, she starts to work through the idea of art and why we make anything beautiful, why we paint anything, a kitchen or a portrait. And she starts to realize that no one has ever made anything beautiful because they thought it was going to last forever. Everything we make is temporary and impermanent, and the temporary nature of stuff doesn't lessen the value of it because that's not the point. The point, as Hilda learns, is connection with other people. It's a coping mechanism and a way to pass the time and a gift for ourselves, for other people, and it's how we process and try to figure life out. There are so many reasons for art, and not one of those reasons are contingent on that piece of art lasting forever, because art is a temporary, beautiful thing for temporary, beautiful people. So Hilda decides about halfway through the book to paint the kitchen, and not just one color, but she's going to make a mural and do one last beautiful art piece for herself and for her family. So that's where I'm going to drop us into this story. It's going faster and faster now. The kitchen mural was detailed and difficult, and progress had been slow. Several times, Hilda had to go back and fix things she wanted perfect. She wanted Marlin to look healthy in the painting. She wanted Nora's eyes to be the exact right shade of blue. She even wanted to capture the sarcastic nature of Nora's cat, who would sometimes stalk past as Hilda painted, sizing up her own likeness disdainfully. She wanted them to look happy, the way they had before last year. She wanted to fully capture what was special and important while also embellishing a little to make herself feel better. And this felt impossible and necessary. And when things feel both impossible and necessary, that's when they start to mess with you. It began to feel like she was trying to save her family, like their preservation depended on her getting their likenesses just right. Some nights she'd get up at 3 a.m. to change something and not come back to bed. Marlon was concerned at first. He saw her getting increasingly frenetic, her perfectionist tendencies growing offshoots and wrapping around her arms and fingers. But he recognized that it was okay if she lost her mind a little bit, that she needed this, and that though she was painting, what she was really doing was grieving. He'd been there too. So he stopped trying to talk her out of it and began to follow her down the stairs to be with her. Hilda pulled the recliner into the kitchen so he could sit with her comfortably, sometimes dozing, sometimes watching. Sometimes they'd chat while she painted. She asked him to talk to her about one of his many special interests, and he rambled. Deep space and physics and philology and Shakespeare and pop culture and music history. Did she know that Julie Andrews learned to play the guitar for her role in The Sound of Music, or that Hawaiians have more than 200 different words for rain? Sometimes they'd sit in silence or with the radio on, Marlon smiling to himself as he admired his wife's work, as he admired his wife, her long fingers ending in perfectly rounded fingernails, the earnestness on her beautiful face, the new lines and great hairs that had appeared over the last couple of years. He loved all of her so much. He tried not to think about how this was going to end and focus on the gifts, late nights, and art and time. Before they knew it, the kitchen mural was finished, but Hilda was not. She thought the last stroke of the brush would bring some closure, that she would understand her husband at last, a feeling of having cleaned a room and shut the door behind her, but the feeling instead was that of another doorway, another open door. And then she realized there was another doorway, the one that led to the dining room. So instead of picking up her paints and getting some fresh air, she simply hauled Marlon's recliner in there and began covering the dining room walls, a field of golden grain beneath a bright blue sky, a red combine in the distance, deer in the foreground, a comforting, familiar scene. Just as in the kitchen, the dining room did not bring closure either. She now has to run out for more paint, and this time she buys a lot more of it. At this rate, the whole house is going to be painted inside and out by the time it's destroyed, and hopefully that will accomplish whatever it is that she needs it to accomplish. And that's all I've got. But I think Robert's going to come up and we're going to do a little Q&A. Yeah.
This one should be working again.
Thank you.
Now I can bring this microphone to anyone who would like to ask a question.
I'll ask a question and get things started. I happen to know that each of these books had a different title when it started. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about the evolution of the title and how it came to be what it is.
Mine had a lot of titles. The first one was Last Christmas, because one of the things that inspired this book was that I was decorating my Christmas tree with my family, and the song Last Christmas by Wham came on. And I was like, oh, Berkeley, someone should write a book about the end of the world, but it's like set at Christmas, and then they can call it Last Christmas. And so then I started writing this book then. But yeah, some other titles that it had were It's Not the End of the World, and which is funny because it's a book about the end of the world. And also it had one called, it was called For a Little While, Everything is Gonna Be All Right, which is fun because the artwork on the front of it is the author or the artist who made this artwork. She had posted it on Instagram and the caption on it was everything is going to be all right. I don't know if you noticed that. But yeah, so when I saw this art, I was like, this needs to be the cover for this book. And I sent it to Deborah and yeah, so that's fun. Oh, yeah, I guess I have the mic on.
A similarly long process. The original working title was a very good title. It was Dark Monarch. but it was taken already because I stole it from a show at the St. Ives Tate Gallery. And it's a long, complicated story about that title, but it involved people getting sued, not me. And so I just didn't want to touch it. And then it was very, very hard for me to come up with another title. I went through like Ron Sexsmith's song titles. I took random sentences out of the book that my publisher hated. And then finally, one day, Deborah, my publisher, sent one of the sentences from the book and was like, I think this should be it. I said, I think you're right. And that was that. I didn't say it right away. It took a while, but I got there.
So Robert, how did you make the transition from historian to author?
Very easily is the short answer, because a lot of sort of the obsessions and the skill sets are the same. But my wife got a job teaching in Western Pennsylvania and we moved down there. And I was on a visa, which meant I could do no work. I could earn no money. And we had a young daughter just beginning school. So I stayed at home with the kid and I wrote and wrote and wrote and eventually started sort of selling short stories, and eventually even managed to convince a publisher to sell one of my books. But it was just circumstances more than anything else that gave me the space to kind of pursue something that had always been interesting to me.
Assuming that you're both readers as well as writers, when you're writing your books, do you avoid reading other books so that it doesn't become part of what you're writing? Does that make sense?
We were just talking about this prior to the reading, and I told a story about when I was young. I thought I came up with the phrase, "the winter of our discontent." And I was very, very proud of it for about 12 hours before my parents pointed out that it was in fact not mine. That said, I personally, I keep reading as much as I can. I feel like my powers of concentration and focus have lapsed to such a degree that I like everything's jumbled anyways. So I'm pretty sure when it comes out, it won't resemble what came in, but there is always a bit of paranoia about accidental theft.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. I often, though, I have a couple of books that really inspire me, like that when I'm writing a book and I'm trying to like stay on track, I will just read like the same chapter out of a book. I don't know, it's just a weird thing that I do to keep myself. They're the books that just make me want to write more. So I probably read less whole books and I'll just read like the same chapter out of a book over and over again. It's kind of a weird neurotic thing, but
Any other questions back here? I actually have one for Suzy. In your bio, you mentioned that you write a lot of stuff inspired by crappy jobs, creepy houses, etc. Did anything in that list inspire this book or creep into it?
yeah, I think this was the one that the whole personal metaphorical apocalypse is. So one thing that inspired this book was a recurring dream that I kept having about the world ending. It was just like this really like lovely dream, which I liked, you know, those dreams where you just wish you could go back into them. Where I'm like standing on a hill and there's this comet coming towards Earth and I just know that we're all gonna die. And I would always wake up from this dream and just be like, oh, that was such a good dream. It was weird, but I had a friend who's like really into like interpreting dreams, and she was like, oh, people have these dreams when something in their life is changing, something really big or important is changing, like maybe they're moving or like friendships are shifting or whatever. And she said like it's a way of your brain telling you that like you're okay and like the change is good and everything is going to be okay. And so I feel like there was just a lot of things in my life at that time that were shifting, and as soon as things kind of settled out, the dream stopped. But a lot of that is kind of like tied up. This book is very much me just exploring those changes and working through them more consciously than I was in my dream. But yeah.
Do we have any final questions here before we move into the signing portion of the evening? Staring at everyone intently, but no one's rising to the bait. Suzy and Robert, do you have anything else that you'd like to say about your books, about the process?
Yeah, actually, one of the interesting things that's came out of having a conversation this evening with our publishers and each other was how much overlap there was in the book. The name Nora is important in both books. There's a lot of other things going on as well. But even when Suzy was reading, I was struck again by the fact that she was writing about art and its relationship to grief in exactly the same way I was. Exactly, a completely different way, but a way that overlapped in an interesting manner. And she was even reading a piece in which eye color was important, and I too was doing the same. So it's just been very interesting to see how well these two books kind of match as a pair. So thank you, Radiant Press, for putting them together.
Suzy, do you want to talk about the spine poetry you discovered?
I don't know, we're gonna get political. We were just noticing that that our books make a spine poetry. The Dark King Swallows the World. I think we've been here before about the recent American election.
Just more reason why everyone should buy both books. Clearly, they're a perfect match. Okay, if there are no further questions here, then I think we'll close things out. Thank you so much to Robert and Suzy for joining us, and we'll invite everyone to come up to the signing table, say hi, get a book signed. Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
So when you were saying that you were noticing, I was noticing